Welcome back to CIA Declassified, the broadcast where we follow the documentation trail wherever it leads, even if it leads us into the remote, high-altitude peaks of European mountain ranges and into the realm of the truly inexplicable. We shift dramatically today from the psychological warfare of Bluebird and Poppycock to deep dive into the agency's surprising and meticulously documented investigation into what it termed unidentified biological entities. Our focus is a file series labeled RDP88 and specifically the document CIA RDP88-00216R 0005 0013 0005-9. This file is not a joke. It is a serious classified compilation of field reports, threat assessments, and meteorological data, all centered around a creature from Alpine folklore, the Tatzelwurm, or claw worm. Historically described as a large, often reptilian or serpent-like animal with two small forelegs, this creature has been reported in Swiss, Austrian, and Bavarian mountain passes for centuries. The question is not if the Tatzelwurm exists, but why the CIA was classifying sightings of it under a strategic threat designation. The answer lies in the Cold War doctrine of deniability and misidentification. In a conflict where every technological edge mattered, any unexplained aerial or ground movement in a sensitive high-altitude zone, where Soviet satellites and communication relays were often tracked, had to be assessed as a potential threat. The agency's analysis had two primary hypotheses regarding UBEs like the Tatzelwurm. One, misidentified adversarial technology. Could the sighting reports be cover for the deployment or testing of unconventional low-altitude Soviet drones, ground effect vehicles, or biological warfare delivery systems? Or two, unconventional biological hazard. Could an indigenous, previously undocumented biological entity present a risk to deployed assets or potentially be weaponized by an adversary? Let's dissect the specific components of the Tatzelwurm dossier contained within the RDP88 file. This was not the work of cryptozoologists, it was the analysis of intelligence professionals looking for patterns. The dossier compiled anecdotal evidence stretching back to the 1960s, cross-referencing local police and forestry reports with known intelligence activity in the area. Key sighting characteristics were logged meticulously. Geographic focus. Reports consistently originated from altitudes above 6,000 feet, often near permanent snow lines or in remote cave systems. This is significant because these areas are difficult for human assets to penetrate easily. Reported size and movement. Descriptions often mentioned a creature between 3 and 6 feet long, moving with unusual speed and silence over difficult terrain. Crucially, the movement was sometimes described as gliding or undulating at speeds faster than a typical mammal could sustain. Biological signatures. The most compelling section of the file details the collection of unexplained trace evidence, that's their words. These fragments, often heavily redacted in the declassified version, refer to large non-mammalian tracks or the temporary localized spike in, quote, unconventional thermal signatures, end quote, recorded by early airborne infrared sensors in targeted areas. The CIA's interests lay in the coincidence of observation. If multiple independent, geographically diverse civilian witnesses report an event that then correlates with an unexplained thermal spike or a classified sensor run, the anomaly is no longer just folklore. It becomes an intelligence variable. Here's a quote from an internal summary memo on the RDP88 file. Quote, while the initial hypothesis remains firmly rooted in localized misperception or fabrication, the consistency of the reported movement geometry in Sector 4, Alpine region, cannot be dismissed. The signature lacks the velocity profile of known airborne platforms and the thermal signature of typical indigenous fauna. Another quote from the High Altitude Biological Survey. Quote, the continued observation of high-fidelity, highly consistent UBE reports necessitates the ongoing allocation of surveillance assets to rule out adversarial experimentation with biological or stealth ground transport platforms utilizing unique locomotion techniques, end quote. The document treats the Tatzelwurm as a placeholder term for a category of unexplained high-altitude phenomenon that needed a tracking designator, much like UFO became UAP. The final section of the file, the threat assessment, reveals the agency's sophisticated attempt to rationalize the irrational. The primary strategic concern was the creature's potential to be used as a psychological warfare tool. If an adversary could successfully generate fear or confusion among the local populace by seemingly deploying or controlling such a creature, it could disrupt communication lines, deter local surveillance, or mask real activity. However, the file also reveals a deep institutional skepticism, which ultimately led to the project being deprioritized. The scientific analysis team, whose findings are also included in the document, largely concluded that the traces were most likely the result of 1. Faulty sensor calibration. The thermal signatures often occurred during heavy cloud cover or atmospheric turbulence, suggesting sensor errors. And 2. Hoaxes and misidentification. Local reports were likely inflated, mistaking large reptiles like European vipers, although not the right size, or common mountain animals like large marmots or badgers for the folkloric Tatzelwurm. Ultimately, the RDP88 Tatzelwurm file is less about proving the creature's existence and more about illustrating the CIA's comprehensive methodology for neutralizing any anomaly, whether technological, psychological, or biological. They were closing a loophole in their threat matrix, in other words. They needed to know definitively that the Tatzelwurm was not a Soviet-designed, remotely operated, heat-shielded ground drone disguised as a beast of myth. When the scientific and intelligence analysts determined the probability of it being a viable threat was negligible, the file was largely closed, leaving behind one of the most curious paper trails in modern intelligence history. We conclude our journey into the high-altitude mysteries of Project Tatzelwurm and the RDP88 files. The project underscores a critical lesson. When an intelligence agency confronts the unexplained, its instinct is to classify it, track it, and neutralize the potential threat, regardless of how absurd the subject matter may appear. If this documented truth has opened your mind and reinforced your determination to understand the world as it truly operates, we rely on your support. First, like the episode and leave us a detailed 5-star review wherever you listen. This is how the analysis exposes the deeper strategic agendas. Second, share this episode with anyone interested in the intersection of intelligence, folklore, and anomaly detection. Now a programming note for our listeners. Our next episode, we return to the skies, but this time much closer to home. We're doing a massive redo, an extended episode on a highly requested topic. We will revisit and dramatically expand our investigation into the most enduring mystery of the Texas frontier, the Candelaria Lights. We will analyze newly released contextual documentation surrounding Project Rio Sentinel, the multi-agency effort to monitor the remote area. For our next investigation, we will dissect the expanded analysis found within the updated files CIA RDP97002, 16R 0005 0013 0005-9. We ask, what did the Air Force and CIA logs definitively record about the recurring luminous objects seen over the Chinati Mountains? What intelligence conclusion was drawn regarding the light's complex maneuvers and apparent non-ballistic flight paths? And why were the military and intelligence communities so determined to classify the Candelaria Lights as a matter of national security under the umbrella of Project Rio Sentinel? Tune in for our next episode to find out. Until then, remember, maintain your vigilance, question the official narrative, and keep your critical thinking sharp. I'll see you in the archives.